In this video, we're going to learn about how to find the equation of a perpendicular bisector. So they can ask you a lot of different things, a lot of different ways. They can ask you for the equation of a perpendicular line through a given point, or they can ask you the equation of a perpendicular bisector. So in this instance, we're going to look at a bisector, and we're going to look at this specific example. So here it says line segment, NY, has endpoints N and Y, N being negative 11, 5, and Y, 5, negative 7. And it wants us to find the equation of the perpendicular bisector of NY. So first and foremost, I want you to get a little bit of a visual in your head. So NY is a line segment. So imagine that this point here is N and this point here is Y. The first thing you have to really understand is where this perpendicular bisector belongs in this image. So if this is NY, for example, would this be the perpendicular bisector? No, because while it looks like it may be perpendicular, it's definitely not bisecting that line segment. So you really need to think about what those two words mean. So first and foremost, let's think about perpendicular. So perpendicular lines intersect to form right angles, right? So perpendicular, we know that means right angles. And if we're talking about the equation of a line, we know that that means negative, let me write it out, negative reciprocal slopes, right? So if we want to find the equation of line that's perpendicular, we're going to need some negative reciprocal slopes. Let me just move this down a little bit. And the other word we need to focus on is the word bisector. So if we were looking for a bisector, that means that that line has to be cut in half. And we always say two congruent halves. But in this case, that means that I need that line to go through the midpoint. So let's draw that image and see if we can get a better line. So we already said this didn't work because it didn't go through the middle. If I draw something like this, it wouldn't work because while it might go through the middle, it's not perpendicular. So my perpendicular bisector is going to look something like this. Okay, it's going to form right angles, and it's going to go through this point here, which we're going to say is the midpoint. So this is all really important. I'm trying to find the equation of this blue line. So the two things that I really need to pay attention to is that I need negative reciprocal slopes and I need the midpoint. And those 2 points that they gave me for N and Y are going to help me to do that. So first and foremost, let's take a look at N and Y. So again, we said N was negative 11, 5. And Y was 5, negative 7. There's a lot of different ways people find slopes. You can absolutely use the slope formula, which is given to you on your reference sheet. But I like to think of a slope very, very simply. I like to think of slope as change in Y over change in X. So if I take a look at my change in Y, which is on this side, how is my Y changing when I go from 5 to negative 7? If you're ever unsure about what that change is, you can always take the bottom number and subtract the top number. But in this case, I know that it means that I'm really just going down 12. Okay? And again, I can always take the bottom number and subtract the top number to get my change in X. And I would see that 5 minus negative 11 is really just 5 plus 11, which means that it's 15. So that means that my change in X over here is 15. So you can see naturally that change, or you can always use your calculator and subtract this, take this bottom number and subtract the top number. So 5 minus negative 11 will give us that 15. So if I'm thinking about my change in Y over change in X, that means in this case, my change in Y was 12. And my change in X was 15. Now, you can also use your calculator. You can enter this fraction in and it'll simplify it for you. But I see that 3 goes into both of these numbers. 3 goes into 12 4 times and 3 goes into 15 5 times. So that means that my slope of this line is 4/5. So just to be very clear, what I just found was the slope of this line, ny, right? Because I used point N and point Y. So to get the slope of my perpendicular line, I need to use negative reciprocal slopes. So that means that my perpendicular slope is now going to be -5/4. So what negative reciprocal slopes mean is I'm going to change the sign and flip the fraction. So since my slope was already positive, it became negative, and instead of 4/5, it became 5/4. If my slope had been negative to begin with, I would have made it positive. So it's just changing the sign. It's not making it negative. Okay, now I need my midpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a line here, and I'm going to use those points N and Y again. I'm going to create a little bit of a visual for you. So I have this line segment. I'm just drawing the same thing, just vertically, right? And if N is -11/5, and Y is 5, -7, doesn't it make sense that my midpoint would be somewhere in the middle of this line, or exactly in the middle of this line, I should say? So what you're really saying to yourself is, okay, what's halfway in between 5 and -7, right? Well, from 5 to -7, we said was -12, right? So if I only want to go half as far, that means I'm just going to subtract 6, which would be -1. Okay, a nice easy way to do this, if you don't like using slopes, is to use the midpoint formula, which is about adding the x's and dividing by 2, adding the y's and dividing by 2. So let me just make that really clear for you guys. The midpoint formula, if you ever wanted to just use the formula, is x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So let's say that this wasn't clear to you. And again, I just want to reinforce that since here I'm going down 12, I'm just going down only half as far to get to that -1. But if you were ever unsure, we can go ahead and use the midpoint formula for the x's. Let's say that was hard for you. So for the midpoint formula for my x's, I would say -11 plus 5 divided by 2. Which is really just -6 divided by 2, which is going to be -3. So that means my x coordinate is -3. So whichever method's easier for you is fine. Okay, but at this point, we have some information. We know that the new line, my perpendicular line, now has a slope of -5/4, and it's going to go through the midpoint, which is -3, -1. So that is all I need to make the equation of my perpendicular line. So please keep in mind, we like point slope form of a line. It's y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1, right? And just like any equation of a line, it should have x's and y's in it, right? So let me just erase this because it looks like I'm getting to the bottom of the page here. I'm going to move this guy up, and I'm going to point out that everything I'm highlighting is going to have to change, meaning that's where I'm inputting some numbers right into these spots. But another point that I want to make is when inputting x and y, or I should say x1, y1, change the signs. So here's the deal. Because this equation has subtraction signs in it, here and here, it's a lot easier to just remember when you plug in those points to change the sign. So what I mean by that is my equation of my line is always going to have this y, always going to have this equal sign, always going to have this parenthesis with an x and an end parenthesis here. And I am expected to put my slope right here and the x coordinate of my midpoint here and the y coordinate of my midpoint here. So let's go ahead and put that slope in first. We already know my slope is going to be -5/4. And now I'm going to go ahead and put in my x coordinate. So the x coordinate of my midpoint is -3, as we saw over here, right? -3. But when I go ahead and put this in, I'm going to put +3. Because the minus sign in my equation makes it so that the signs just change when I put it in. And since the y coordinate is -1, when I go ahead and put this in, it is +1. So this line, this equation, is of the perpendicular bisector of my original line, which means that equation works for this guy here. Okay, so I can say, so what was it? It was y, let me just double check. Y plus 1 equals -5/4. Sorry if it makes me dizzy. X minus 3. That is the equation, sorry, x plus 3. That is the equation of that line, okay? Because it goes through the midpoint of ny and it is perpendicular. It has a negative reciprocal slope. So it's a lot of work. The main thing that I would remember is that this equation does not need to be solved for y. The only time you ever solve for y in this circumstance is if you want to answer a multiple choice question and the answers are in y equals. But if this is a short response, leave it like this. If the multiple choice is already in slope-intercept form or point-slope form, that's great too, okay? So just as like a little refresher, let's go ahead and add a page in. And I just want to point out just the main ideas. So for a perpendicular bisector, you need two things, or a few things. Let's make a list, right? You're going to find the slope of the original line, right? Then you are going to find a perpendicular slope using negative reciprocals. Then you are going to find the midpoint. And then my final step, step 4, is you are going to plug in your perpendicular slope. So I'm going to highlight it here. So let's see, perpendicular slope, which is our negative reciprocal, right? And midpoint into the equation. And we're going to use point slope 99% of the time. So that's going to be y minus, and then I'm going to put y1 equals, and put m, x minus x1. And the colors just to remind you what gets changed and what doesn't. So this is the big idea. This is how you find the perpendicular bisector. It is a very common multiple choice question, and it is even more common as a short response question. The only other way you can see this happening is if they just ask you for a perpendicular line and not a bisector. So remember, in order to follow these steps, you need to see the word perpendicular and bisector in the problem. If you have any questions, you know where to find me.